Hi, and welcome to the first video on first language acquisition. You may be wondering, why are we talking about first language acquisition if this is a course about second language acquisition? Well, I'd like to point out two things. It's really important to understand the context of acquisition, since children always acquire language in a naturalistic context, and adults may or may not have the support of a naturalistic context. So understanding something about first language acquisition will be really important when we talk about these contexts. A second reason is because it's also related to the topic of age effects and critical period. People assume that children learn languages more quickly and easily than adults. It's really beneficial to know something about first language acquisition to see if that's really true. So overall, having a basic understanding of first language acquisition will allow us to compare it to second language acquisition. Let's get started. In this chapter, the author of the textbook reviews the stages of first language acquisition, several theoretical views, and then finally differences and similarities between L1 and L2 acquisition. In this video, I'll only be talking about the first part of the chapter, stages of L1 acquisition. So one thing that becomes obvious very quickly is that first language acquisition starts very, very early. It may seem obvious to point out, and yet it's still important, is that a lot of language acquisition is happening before children actually utter their first words. So babies, very young babies in their first months of life, can perceive sound contrasts that are not present in their environment. For example, babies learning English can perceive sound contrasts in Hindi, a language that they don't hear. But they lose this ability rather quickly. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because you'll be watching a TED Talk by a researcher that studies this very phenomenon. The productive side of first language acquisition, of course, begins with babbling. So young babies will begin to babble around 4 or 6 months of age, and they'll start with something called reduplicated babbling. So something like ba, ba, ba. And then they'll move on to non-reduplicated babbling, in which they vary the sounds that they're producing. So something like ba, da, ga. The next stage is the one-word stage. And this is when children actually begin to produce their first word or first words. And Hummel points out that nouns tend to predominate during this one-word stage. One question that comes up, and that she doesn't address in the book, is whether this noun biased, as it's called, is it universal or is it language dependent? Is it culture specific? And that's something that researchers have been debating and researching in this field. So what happens after the one-word stage, after children begin to produce their first words? Well, the important thing to note here is that the growth of early vocabulary is very gradual. So children build up that early vocabulary very slowly. It can take them 5 to 6 months to arrive at a vocabulary of about 50 words. But once they reach that 50-word mark, and of course that's approximate, once they reach that 50-word mark, something really exciting begins to happen. They begin to combine these words into phrases. So they might say things like mama sleep, more cake, daddy bike, in order to express the reality that's happening around them. At the same time, as children are beginning to combine words, which is known as the two-word stage, they also experience a huge vocabulary spurt. So there's this sudden explosion of vocabulary. And we think that children can learn anywhere between 4 and 6 or maybe even more new words per day. So after what seems like a very slow start, the vocabulary suddenly explodes in quantity. And researchers think that one explanation for this is this idea of fast mapping. So the idea that children can learn a new word from only one exposure. Now, learn here has an asterisk because nobody thinks that they learn everything there is to know about the word from one exposure. So they don't construct a full lexical representation of the word, but they construct some representation that then is later filled in with more specific knowledge. After the two-word stage, children begin to form longer strings, so it may be anywhere between 3 to 5 or even more words that start to resemble sentences in the language that they're learning. But these sentences don't look exactly like adult utterances because they often omit function words such as articles or prepositions, and that's why it's known as the telegraphic stage. So I'll show you a few examples here from French. First language French, a child might produce something like où est poupée, where the determiner is left off, or a longer string like le chat il joue la balle, where the preposition with or avec is left out. So these are sentences that certainly resemble the syntax of French, but there are elements missing. They communicate exactly what the child wants to say, but it is still telegraphic to some degree. I want to give you a little bit more info about stages because it's very important to keep in mind that the precise age at which children reach these developmental milestones varies. So they go through somewhat predictable stages, but the ages at which they reach those milestones, really there's a lot of variability there. So for example, Hummel states that first words appear at approximately 12 months, but in reality this is much more like a window of a time frame, anywhere between 11 and 14 months. And it can even be a larger window, especially when we're talking about bilingual children who are usually on a different timeline. I want to finish up the video with a couple of additional details about L1 acquisition that are important. One of them is this idea of U-shaped learning. So it's the idea that children will initially produce the correct form, such as the correct past tense, went, and then they'll actually regress to what is an inaccurate form like goed, and then finally at the end of this process go back to the correct form, went. So what's really happening here is overgeneralization or over-regularization, right? So children are applying a rule, in this case the ed, adding ed to form a past tense, they're applying that to an irregular. So they're overgeneralizing or over-regularizing a form. And this is also evident in the idea that children apply rules is also evident in experimental work. So like the famous WUG test, the very simple and elegant experiment that was carried out in the late 1950s by Jean Burko. And what this kind of experiment shows is that children are doing more than simply imitating what they hear in the environment. The idea is that they're actually applying underlying rules to nonce words or words that don't exist, words that they've never heard before, and yet they're able to correctly form the plural, or they're able to correctly form the simple past of a verb that they've never heard before. So this has tremendous implications for theories of language acquisition, as we'll learn in the next video.